For those that don't know me, I'm Amy Wilson, and I'm the chair of the section, as well as an applied statistician at the University of Edinburgh. And I'm very pleased to say that today we've got David Spiegelhalter here to talk to us about communicating statistical evidence in public inquiries and in court. After the talk, we're going to have a little bit of time for questions and discussion. I've asked that we can keep the session running till 2:15, so if that goes on a bit, that's okay. But obviously, feel free to leave at 2 if you can't stay for the extra bit of time. So firstly, the session's being recorded, and after the event, it will be posted on the RSS YouTube channel. So if there's anyone else that you think might be interested, feel free to share that. To avoid disturbance, if you could make sure your mics are turned off, that would be good. I don't know about videos. I kind of like to see other people there when I'm giving a talk, but if they cause any problem, if it starts to cause any problems with interference, maybe we might have to turn the videos off as well. For anyone that's not already on the mailing list, if you'd like to hear more about the Stats and Law section, you can sign up for the mailing list on the main RSS website, and you don't have to be an RSS fellow to join that list. One of the things that you can access also on that webpage is one of the recent outputs of the section that I just wanted to flag today, and that's a report that a subset of the Stats and Law Committee published on statistical issues in medical misconduct cases, and that's particularly about how to distinguish between healthcare serial killers and coincidences. So you can read that report on our website, and I'll post a link in the chat during the talk. There's also a summary document that covers the key points. So slightly on that topic, I'm just going to point out at the beginning that there's been a lot of media interest in the case of Lucy Letby, especially this week. So as this legal action's ongoing, we won't be able to discuss that case at all in this meeting. So I do hope that once that is finished, we will be able to discuss that a little bit more, but we have to wait till the legal action is complete. So one more advert. Some of you may be aware that Jane Hutton, who was the previous chair of the section, won the 2023 RSS Mardia Interdisciplinary Prize to run a set of 4 workshops on stats and the law. So the first was held back in January on probabilistic decision support tools, and there's a summary of that meeting on the Mardia website. I'll also put that into a link, the link in the chat. So the next meeting is next month in Edinburgh. That's on civil litigation in personal injury. And then there's 2 later workshops, one on understanding legal systems and one on algorithms in the justice system. So those will also be posted about, there's a separate Mardia webpage I'll post a link to, but there we'll also advertise those on the main section webpage, the RSS site. So those workshops are invitation only, but I think it's still possible to register interest in the June workshop. And as we get closer to the other 2, it will be possible to kind of register interest in advance for those. Okay, so finally, just in case you missed that part, I think if you want to make David bigger, you can kind of pin his picture using the 3 dots in the corner of his video. So I think we're all here for one thing. I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Sir David Spiegelhalter to talk to us today. So David's an emeritus professor of statistics at the University of Cambridge and was previously chair of the Winton Centre for Risk and Evidence Communication. He was also, amongst many, many other things, a previous president of the Royal Statistical Society. So I don't think he needs much more introduction than that. So David, do you want to start?
Thanks very much indeed. Yeah, I'm sorry. You may have noticed I was running between offices trying to find somewhere where I could actually charge my computer. So it's slightly amateur presentation there. But here I am, and great to see so many people here. Really nice to talk. I'll probably go on for about 45 minutes, and then I'd like to leave time for some questions. Okay, so can I just check that you can see my screen all right? Is that all right? Okay, good. Okay, so that's me. I just a bit of background. I do a lot of statistical communication now. I can't resist a quick plug. Got another book coming out September the 19th, The Art of Uncertainty. So I sorry, shameless self-promotion there. But what I want to talk about really is public inquiries, which is, rather it's very prominent public inquiries in the UK at the moment. We've got them going on a number of important issues. They have a particular process in the UK, these statutory public inquiries, which have very strong legal powers. In particular, they can compel witnesses to give evidence, and that's why at the infected blood inquiry, you could just compel the Prime Minister to come along and give evidence to that. And people are registered as core participants who have entitlements to receive information. And in particular, the inquiries often commission expert groups to answer specific questions set by the inquiry. One can consider this as kind of mandated science. You're asked a set of questions which you have to try to answer, no matter what evidence is available. And then at the actual inquiry, representatives of those expert groups get up and are examined by counsel for the inquiry. It's not a cross-examination. You don't get people from different sides questioning you, but you are examined as if in a court of law. And these are very expensive, these inquiries, and who knows what the COVID inquiry is going to end up costing. Okay, so I'd like to start by talking about the most current one, the infected blood inquiry. And the crucial thing about that is that it's due to give it its final report next Monday, where there's a lot of coverage going on at the moment about this building up to that report, and there will be a lot of coverage on Monday. Now, a lot of that coverage will be about who's to blame, culpability, compensation, and so on. And I'm not going to deal with any of those issues at all. I'm just going to deal with statistical issues that the statistical expert group were asked to answer. And what this is investigating the infected blood and blood products that were given in the UK between 1970 and 1991 to people with blood disorders, often generally haemophilia, and those receiving transfusions for any reason that someone might get a blood transfusion, and whether the blood was contaminated, in particular with either HIV or hepatitis C. And I was part of the statistics expert group that was asked to estimate the number of infections and the attributable deaths. And it's our numbers that are being used in all the publicity at the moment. And we gave evidence in November 2022 on this. We wrote a report in September 2022. That's the main expert group, but not in there are Ruth McCabe and Sarah Hayes, who did a huge amount of the work that I'm going to just be talking about briefly. Okay, so actually doing all this was complex because, as you can see from the people on the right, they were slightly distracted by COVID while the inquiry was going on. So this is an example of what we produce in our report. And what I want to just illustrate, I can't go through it anything in great detail, is just a few points about dealing with this, as I said, this mandated science, having to answer questions, even if the evidence is not that reliable. And that's a running theme throughout all these, the inquiries I'm going to talk about. So this was the first question: people with bleeding disorders, often haemophilia, how many got HIV? And as we'll see in other inquiries, that quite often in some areas there's multiple data sources. So in this case, there was a Macfarlane Trust of people who had applied for compensation. There was a haemophilia a database by the Haemophilia Centre Doctors Organisation, and also there was a Health Security Agency, previously Public Health England, database of people with HIV. And all of those, we had access to the numbers, not the detailed database. So it's impossible to triangulate in detail to use any sort of capture recapture to look at individual cases. We only had the access to the totals. And that's just a summary of what we could conclude from those totals. And in the end, based on that information, we concluded that about 1,250 people with bleeding disorders were infected with HIV. About 3 characters have died, and around half have died of HIV-related causes. And those are the numbers that are being quoted at the moment. You notice at the bottom that we gave a confidence rating for each of our conclusions, and based on this is something I really think is important, that analysts come up with some sort of meta statement of how confident they are that the data available can actually answer the question they've been asked. And for this one, we're moderate or high. We feel that this was, this is good data, and is largely self-supporting. There wasn't a conflict really between the numbers substantially. And so we had moderate, high conclusions. We used on the confidence scale, the one that has been used by SAGE during COVID, which is low, low to moderate, moderate, moderate to high, and high. So that's what, for that, we're fairly confident. I should, just in case I forget, we were asked, for example, about hepatitis B infections, and the data was, we just had such low confidence in the evidence available that we refused to try to put a number on it. So that's why I feel that having these ideas of your confidence that you can answer the questions is very useful in order to qualify your conclusions. Now, for HIV infections, you can count them. There are databases, there are registries. But when it comes to the hepatitis C, we obviously know some individuals who are infected with hepatitis C. I was listening to a story about one on the radio this morning from blood transfusions, but many will never have been identified. Either they're still living with it, or they've died of it, or of something else in the meantime. And so we can't count people. We have to estimate them, and that's the point. We have to actually build a complex statistical model, and this is a major exercise in building essentially a causal model right through from in the proportion of donations, blood donations that were given that might have been infected with hepatitis C, and then we look at the number of units that are transfused. We have to try to dig up data of all the transfusion practices 50 years ago, in some cases. Then we estimate the number of people infected with hepatitis C, and the number of people chronic hepatitis C surviving at least 10 years. Then we look at the survivors, and then we try to estimate the deaths due to hepatitis C. So each of these is a task on its own, requiring its own data. It's at least you can think of it as kind of forward spreadsheet. In fact, then it's all handled through a Monte Carlo analysis. But in fact, this was all programmed in R by Ruth and Sarah, who took it on. Massive. Each one of these tasks was a major piece of work on its own. So I can't go through all that in detail in the report. It's all there in kind of exhausting detail. But one issue I'd like to bring up is the fact that we are necessarily dependent on judgment. In some of those, we had some good data and could be fairly confident, but others we were necessarily dependent on judgment. And this is a story I think is fascinating. That I mean, many of you won't remember the whole AIDS scare in the mid-1980s, the "Don't Die of Ignorance" sort of campaigns that were then. But the point is that hepatitis C didn't start until testing didn't start until 1991, but during the mid-1980s where HIV had been identified, and there were guidance to try to prevent people at high risk of HIV from giving blood. Not hepatitis C, because that hepatitis C itself hadn't been really identified as a separate disease. But all the emphasis was on trying to prevent people with HIV from giving blood. And we were unsure of the effect of this guidance on people who had ever injected drugs, who were the highest risk of having hepatitis C. Did this guidance work? Did this stop people giving blood? And we asked experts for their judgments. How much did this guidance reduce the proportion of injecting drug users giving blood? And we were surprised to find out, by talking to people who were around at the time, there was a perverse incentive at the time for high-risk people to offer to give blood, because it was a way of getting an HIV test without going to a special clinic. And back then, there was a massive stigma around HIV. So if you offered to give blood, you got an HIV test. And of course, if you didn't have HIV, then you gave blood, but you may have had hepatitis C. And so, from that, I couldn't understand why, there would still be people giving blood with hepatitis C at high risk of having hepatitis C, and yet it is really plausible given that insight we got only by talking to people. So we ended up doing this huge Monte Carlo analysis, a lot of sensitivity analysis, deterministic, changing the structure of the model, changing the assumptions, producing the uncertainty intervals through the predictive Monte Carlo analysis, and basically concluding that, roughly 27,000 people who got infected with hepatitis C through blood transfusions. So that might have been women after pregnancy, people after car accidents, or any sort of reason where you might get a blood transfusion. And about 1,800 people had died because of it by the end of 2019. These are not counted. It's estimated from statistical data because many of those may not have ever, wouldn't have realized, in fact, that they were dying because of their hepatitis C infection. Some of them were because of liver disease, whatever, which was clear. So with moderate confidence, we are answering the questions. I think these are reasonable numbers, but only moderate confidence in them because there's so many assumptions that go into the modeling there. These are not counts. So just to finish, I got to race through this because there's a lot to talk about. I'd just like to talk briefly about the process of giving evidence when you're in the room and the families of the victims are in the front row of the audience. And this has been a repeated situation over the 3 inquiries I'm going to discuss. And it's a very powerful experience. And what we actually, having done this now a number of times, we've worked out in a way of something to say in the report and when we're giving evidence verbally to say that to acknowledge that all these statistics, these numbers can sound rather cold and harsh to people who knew the victims who have suffered so much as a result of this tragedy. But we do think that we recognize every one of these numbers as an individual story and is terribly important, but it's only by aggregating them up that we can get a feeling, an impression, a knowledge, an understanding of the magnitude of what has happened. And so we will carry on talking about numbers of deaths and excess deaths and using these statistics because we do feel in the end this is a very valuable thing to do. And the families have always been incredibly accepting of that. And it was very moving at the end of the the infected blood inquiry, how they came up and thanked us. I was overcome, actually. I couldn't deal with it, for all our work. And we thought, well, we've done the work, but you've had this hanging over you for decades. So it just this comes up again and again that the actual performance at the inquiry is quite a strong experience. Okay, let's go back again. That's the most recent one we just done. Back to 1998. Here we are, babies with congenital heart disease at the Bristol Royal Infirmary with a lot of deaths that got reported by a whistleblower and finally led to first of all, a case at the General Medical Council where I was representing the GMC in their prosecution of the doctors, and then in the public inquiry afterwards, which was to do with children's heart surgery at Bristol Royal Infirmary, 1984 to 1995, the Kennedy inquiry, a massive inquiry that had a big impact. Again, a bit like the HIV for the infected blood, even worse, we had 7 different data sources that were being looked at there. Multiple, and the 2 on the left were the main national registries. There was one kept a professional cardiac surgical register, and then the administrative data, the hospital episode statistics, and all sorts of local sources. We got all that data, and none of it agreed with each other. Not even the count of the number of operations that taken place. So there's no single correct data source. It was all based on triangulation and so on. There we are. This is the main team. It looks like something out of Reservoir Dogs, doesn't it? But there we all were in the newspaper. Mike Campbell, Stephen Evans, Paul Ayling, Gordon Murray, and me were the main team on that, doing the analysis. But lots of other people working on it. And this was essentially a summary of the data, which just looked at. This was just between 1991 and 1995. Open heart surgery in under 1s, the most difficult set of surgery for transposition of the great arteries and other really serious problems. And there are some forest plots. On the left is the data from the cardiac surgical register, and on the right is the hospital episode statistics, which broadly agree. And Bristol is number 1. And with substantially, clearly higher mortality than the others, and the others are in broad agreement. Something I should say is that look at the average mortality rate is about 12, 13%. It's now 2% just in 30 years. Staggering improvement. And the operations have got even more complex. Quite amazing improvement over that time. But Bristol stands out. Now, you can look at those plots, and we estimated excess deaths and all that sort of thing with uncertainty about them. We did a hierarchical Bayesian analysis, lots of complex stuff. But when we first produced that, what we didn't do, because I don't think it's obvious from the plot, unless you've got a really good insight, there's something we're missing from those plots. There's a bit of information that's really missing. Unless you plot it the right way, you miss it. And let's see what you do when you plot the mortality rate against the number of cases per year. And you look at essentially the mortality rate against the volume, the denominator. And then using that same data, you get a very clear pattern. And I fitted a logistic regression there, ignoring Bristol, which is the red dot, sticking it, I saw them, but ignoring Bristol, you still see a clear pattern that the hospitals with the highest throughput had the lowest mortality. All of those, the four highest hospitals had the below average mortality, and the smaller hospitals had above average mortality. So a clear picture there, which caused a lot of fuss and concern. But I didn't spot that. When I first looked at the forest plot, I hadn't realized it until it was suggested to have a look at that. And there it is, really powerful, regression analysis. There's other plots, again, things that come up when you start looking at stuff. This is just looking at the outcomes, looking at the age of the baby. And I don't think the plot's not that clear, but if you look along at 11 months, you notice for Bristol, a big spike of cases, some of whom died, but at 10 and 11 months, but not in the other centres. So the bars on the left at each month are the other centres, and they tend to go down over time, whereas Bristol's got a big spike in cases at 11 months. The point is you had to do your surgery within the year in order to get the funding. And due to the disorganisation in Bristol, the babies were brought in late, just in time to come in under the year. So a lot of this was not just the surgical competence. A lot of this was the organisation of the unit, which put the surgeons at a disadvantage by having the babies being done too late. So again, it's only by looking at the running theme throughout this is only by looking at the right data that you suddenly get an insight as to what's going on. So the inquiry concluded between 30 and 35 children would have died, who died, probably survived, treated elsewhere. About a third received less than adult care. And the flaws and failures were as much to do with the hospital and the organisation, the culture, as just the surgical competence. Again, we gave evidence with the families, with the parents, with the children sitting in the front row of the audience, a very powerful experience. Okay, as the parents at the Bristol Heart Inquiry in the front row. Also in 1998, this gentleman, Harold Shipman, Britain's greatest serial killer. I got nothing to hide, he said when he did. Shipman inquiry concluded that he had murdered at least 215 of his patients and probably 45 more. There's a map of his victims over Hyde, a town outside Manchester. It's a bit like the cholera map of the Broad Street pump, in that you should be able to identify his practice, which was in Market Street, right in the middle of where those main blobs are. So quite horrific crimes, and a public inquiry was set up after he was finally arrested and convicted and sent to prison. And the public inquiry, for example, just to get a feeling for what he was doing in 1998, just before his arrest. Look at that period covers about 6 weeks or so. Yeah, about 6 weeks. And those are the deaths of his patients. And if you look down the right, almost all of them were unlawful killing or a conviction. So this is quite extraordinary activity. So, and that plot shows an idea of what was going on. The age of the victim on the left and the year of the murder along the bottom. Women in black, you can see largely it was older women, but over time, his victims got younger. He had a gap around 1991, 1992, and that's when he left a joint practice where it's thought he might have suspected that he was being suspected, and took up as a single-handed general practitioner, where he could carry on his activities. So the crucial thing is, we were asked as experts a number of questions. The main one was what was going on. What can we learn from the data? And secondly, could he have been caught earlier? And so we had to go to answering those. One of the things we had access to some fantastic data collected by a professor of general practice, Richard Smith, who went into the cremation records of thousands of patients, of both of Shipman and other general practitioners in the area. And the cremation certificates actually have a time of death, the time of death on it, right? As opposed to the death certificate doesn't have that. And so what they look at then is what time were people dying? And this is, if you look at comparison GPs, that's the time at which people died. It's effectively uniform over all 24 hours. And when you look at Shipman's data, it looked like that. So Shipman's patients died between 2 and 3 in the afternoon on the whole. And I think it's the most chilling graph I've ever seen. You don't need great statistical analysis to spot that something was going on, but of course nobody was looking at this data. And it was a brilliant insight to actually, look at collect that data and to look at it. Otherwise we just wouldn't have known that. And that, of course, we knew from other sources as well, but this just reinforces the fact that he used to do home visits after lunch and, look at his victims and say, I'm just going to give you something to make you more comfortable, give them inject them with a huge overdose of diamorphine, essentially a heroin overdose, and they would die, in front of him. And then he would forge and change the medical records to cover that up. And he did that again and again and again. A single post-mortem would have caught him, but there were no post-mortems until 15 of his victims were exhumed, and they found the high levels of diamorphine in them. Okay, so when could he have been caught? We were asked. We couldn't answer that. We could have, but we did try to answer when could he have been identified as different? Because as statisticians, it's not, we can just look at the data. So we can't give a reason for the data being strange, but we could say could he have been identified as being different? And this was the sort of data again that we were given of patients, the number of deaths. This is the cumulative excess deaths. How many more were being observed compared with how many would be expected based on the age and sex of his patients, compared and standardized for the area where he was working. And so this is the cumulative excess mortality. And it gets to about 250 by the time of his arrest, which, not coincidentally, I don't think, is almost exactly the same number as the inquiry concluded of the people he had murdered. So a purely statistical approach, based purely with no knowledge of what was going on, just by looking at the numbers, comes to the same conclusion. The excess death calculation almost exactly matches the number of his victims. And so the point is, though, if someone had been looking at that data, which they weren't, when would it have been reasonable to blow a whistle? So this is a problem in sequential analysis. We could start doing, statistical tests, chi-squared tests or stuff, at every year, but we know there's a problem. If you keep on doing statistical tests, you're going to find a positive result in the end, even if nothing is going on. So when to blow the whistle? Fast forward 2021. Okay, so now I'm going to do a little methodological diversion, to talk about some stats, some maths, and come back to that shipment problem. So let's look at a whole problem. Let's go back to the COVID era. God, it'd be lovely to forget it, but here we go. Lateral flow tests. They in 2021, it was estimated they would detect about 50% of people carrying an infection. And only about 1 in 1,000 false positive rate. I don't like that term because it's so ambiguous, but it's a proportion of the uninfected wrongly getting a positive test. So those are the sort of numbers that we were told. So let's say that at a particular period in 2021, when the virus was not a huge amount of virus circulating, about 1 in 330 school students were infected. So I'm talking about, repeated testing in schools. And if a student gets a positive test, what's the chance they really have the infection? Okay, so everyone knows these sorts of questions, very familiar sort of Bayes theorem type questions, but the intuition is still quite difficult. So, I always ask people, I'm not going to try doing it now. Is it 99.9%, 99%, 60%, or 50%? So you just guess in your mind what you think is the chance that they actually do have the infection. And the easiest way to go through that analysis is using expected frequencies. What would we expect to happen to 1 million school students being tested each day or over a period? Say 1 in 300, so 3,000 have got the disease, got COVID, 997,000 haven't. You detect half the people with the disease, that's 1,500 true positives, but you detect 1 in 1,000 of people without the disease, that's nearly 1,000 false positives. So there's about 2,500 positive tests, of whom only 1,500 are truly infected. So about 60% chance they're truly infected. So 60% is the right answer. I hope you got that. Hope you'd managed to do that in your head. And the remaining 40% of positive tests are false positives. So there's nearly half the kids being sent home, or their class being sent home, or whatever, not going to school, was actually a false positive result. So that sort of reasoning is difficult, unintuitive. Hearing politicians struggle with this was an embarrassment at the time. So, but tricky. So this, in fact, of course, is Bayes' theorem. What we've got is prior odds on having COVID was 3 over 997, 3 in 1,000, 3 over 997. The likelihood ratio, which is the probability of getting a positive test given you got COVID, which is 50%, divided by the probability of a positive test if you haven't got COVID, which is 0.1%. So the likelihood ratio is 500 in this case, multiplied by the prior odds gives you posterior odds, which is about 3 over 2. So easy to do as a Bayesian argument, really. Should be able to do that. Well, I still find it difficult in my head, but you really can do that pretty easily. So likelihood ratio of 500 from the lateral flow test. Okay, so what this really was is a reason for starting to focus on the likelihood ratio, that this is the crucial element in deciding what is the value of a piece of evidence. A bit of moral, if you think you found a needle in a haystack, your confidence should depend on how many needles were in there in the first place. Just be wary about spotting a needle in a haystack. So, I mean, I think everybody in this audience probably knows all about this already, but I might as well go through it. The prosecutor's fallacy applied to this diagnostic testing problem is to talk about to confuse the probability of a positive test if you're not infected, which is 1 in 1,000, this false positive rate, with the probability of not being infected if you get a positive test, the reverse, which is 40%. These are completely different measures. Easy to confuse, the law of the transpose conditional, we can call it. A given probability of A given B is confused with the probability of B given A. And you think, who could make that mistake? How could anyone make that mistake? If you're a dog, you've probably got 4 legs. It's not the same if you've got 4 legs, you're probably a dog. Who could make that mistake? Except it's made continually in popular discussions. So likelihood ratios are the currency in forensic science, evaluative forensic science. It's within a criminal case, it's the probability of the evidence if the prosecution claim is true, and the claim could be of all sorts, where the presence of somebody, that this particular shoe left this mark or whatever, and the probability of evidence if the defense claim is true. Basic, likelihood ratio that is assessed and communicated in the case of DNA likelihood ratio. And there's people in the audience here who know a huge amount more about this than I do, so I'm slightly embarrassed talking about it. But basically, the probability of a DNA match if the suspect is present divided by the probability of the DNA match of somebody else done by somebody else, a random person, is usually considered that the numerator is 1, and the denominator is the probability, the random match probability, the probability of the random person. And but the prosecutor's fallacy in court is when the probability of a match, if the semen came from another person, is 1 in a billion, which might be a reasonable thing to say, is wrongly interpreted or even stated as the probability that the semen came from another person is 1 in a billion. Or even if that's, how it's interpreted by the jury. So it could be so easily done in that way. So the enormous, enormous care in communicating these numbers is absolutely essential. Okay, this is the standard level for communicating likelihood ratios in forensic science recommended. So the lateral flow test with a likelihood ratio of 500 would be considered moderately strong support for someone having COVID. This is I like this example, a recent case of disputed identity. Saturday, 25th of August 2012, archaeologists start digging in a car park in Leicester. Many of you know what's going to happen. The site of the Greyfriars Friary. And in a few hours, on that very first day of digging, right below the first trench, they found their first skeleton, and there it is. You may be able to spot something in that skeleton. It's got a curved spine in that skeleton. That's what they found on the very first day. And they were looking for King Richard III, who was well known to have notoriously had curvature of the spine. So they found him. First day, first skeleton. There he was. They pack up and go home. But was it him?
I think he was saying his laptop was running out of battery, so I'm going to assume that he's currently trying to find a charging cable.
While David's trying to resurrect himself, I was just very surprised by the assertion that the false positive rate of lateral flow tests was 1 in 1,000 in 2021, having looked into the evidence for the accuracy of PCR. Do you happen to know the references for that, Sheila? You put
offhand, no, but it's very much a reasonable assessment of this of a specificity.
Right, because when I actually looked at the details of what Imperial College quoted from the research articles bore no resemblance to what Imperial College quoted. And actually went and read the papers, so I was just a bit surprised.
No, I think that's fairly firm, actually. I mean, it's very difficult to work it out other than, using the test in people whom you think to be not infected, and in a large number using the few who test positive as giving you the estimate. So you need large studies, obviously, in order to get a fairly precise answer. And so I don't know which literature you're talking about, Jane, offhand. So I'm sorry, I can't help. But I think that 99.9% is about where we're at.
Oh, we're back again, right? And I'm charging, I think. Dear, oh dear. Okay, so there was a wonderful paper in Nature actually using forensic. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes,
Amy,
David.
put your hands up, thumbs up if you're okay. Oh, good, right. Okay, lovely paper in Nature showing using the techniques of forensic and science on Richard III. And they came up looking at items of evidence and using likelihood ratios, fairly conservative estimates, to look at the different aspects of the radiocarbon dating. Very weak evidence because everybody in that area, in that church, was buried at around about the same time. Age and sex of the skeleton matched, but again, that was quite common around then. The scoliosis, the curvature of the spine, they considered pretty strong evidence, 200 likelihood ratio of 200, but they have found scoliosis in on other skeletons. They had some database of how often that was found. Post-mortem wounds, mitochondrial DNA, on the female line, not that he, indirect female line was pretty strong DNA evidence, but the male DNA didn't match. But that's quite reasonable to think there's gaps in terms of mistaken paternity over the last 600 years. If you multiply these up, they do that in the Nature paper. You get a likelihood ratio of 6.5 million, which was strong enough to get him buried in Leicester Cathedral with full honours. This is what you're not allowed to do in court, is to essentially multiply up the likelihood ratios together to as we would do using a full Bayesian analysis. So the point about it is that in general in court, many of these statistical issues are not very well handled. And there's a primer that some of us were involved in writing, led by Rupin Dundee. I did the first draft of that with David Kitchen, who's a Supreme Court judge, but also got a very strong scientific training. It was excellent. And that says you can't use Bayes' theorem but we can use likelihood ratios, provided you've got a sound basis. The other thing it does say, as mentioned before, is that you've got to be really, really wary of concluding anything as a coincidence based on any sort of intuition. But we can go back to 1941 at Bletchley, where Turing was breaking the Enigma codes, and to do this is the bomb machine that was used to break the codes, and he started off by running messages through the bambarismas, which were women with punch cards who looked at matching patterns and to try to see if two messages had the same settings. And so he knew about Bayes' theorem. You should multiply likelihood ratios. The probabilities of a match if the messages were from the same settings, if messages were from different settings. So this was the likelihood ratio that he was interested in. And he realized it was easier to take logarithms and then instead of multiplying likelihood ratios like we do for Bayes' theorem, we could add log likelihood ratios. And he took logarithms, multiplied by 10, rounded them, and this formed whole numbers, which he called the weight of evidence. And this could be done by hand by operators. And so he had the starting points for the bomb machine were based on a sort of manual use of log likelihood ratios. Extraordinary work. He wrote all this in 1942, and unfortunately, it was only released by GCHQ in 2012. So there's this wonderful document, Alan Turing, including his definition of probability and all the work he did, and they sat on it for 70 years while everyone else had to rediscover it, which of course they did. But it is a wonderful story, and his use of probability in the code breaking is quite extraordinary, but we didn't see it for 70 years. Okay, so the crucial thing, back to this one, when should we blow the whistle? How should we do the sequential test? Well, we're testing two hypotheses, and we need a sequential test of the two hypotheses. We can use the likelihood ratio, the probability of getting so many deaths if Shipman had, say, twice the normal death rate, compared with the probability of getting so many deaths if Shipman had a normal death rate. So those are the null hypothesis underneath, the alternative on the top, and we're talking about log likelihood ratios. And so actually is known that if we do a cumulative sum of the log likelihood ratio, you get an optimal test. And all this was developed in 1943 independently by George Barnard in the UK and Abraham Wald in the US. Again, without talking to Turing, who was essentially doing the same thing just up the road. But that essentially means we should be looking at cumulative log likelihood ratios in order to establish the weight of evidence. And when we applied this to a whole lot of areas, we applied it to Shipman, it could turn out that using the sequential probability ratio test, which is the cumulative log likelihood ratio, if we use that statistic, which then has got fixed boundaries for a particular size and power of the test, we can pre-draw this and just put the dots on as they accumulate, and we would have detected shipment by 1985 at a false positive and a false negative rate of 1 in 100,000. Alpha and beta 1 in 100,000. So it could have been very clear alarm in 1985 after only 40 deaths. You could have blown a whistle. You couldn't conclude criminality, but you could have blown a whistle after only 40 deaths using this very basic statistic. There's some risk adjustment in that, which was a development that we put into the basic work. So, and that method now is being used in for monitoring pediatric intensive care in the UK, absolutely untouched. But then the group, Claire Marshall, Nikki Bess, Alex Bottle, and Paul Aylin, then looked at what would happen if we used such a Q-sum analysis, slightly different sequential test, but basically the same idea of cumulative log likelihood ratios. If we use this for monitoring mortality rates in primary care, and what they found is they found 6 GPs worse than Shipman, who would have signaled before Shipman did on using a Q-sum, which is another form of cumulative log likelihood ratio test. So that's interesting. Out of 1,000, they found 6 who were worse than Shipman. So what this shows, absolutely, people can usually guess who these people were. These were really good caring GPs who were enabling their elderly patients to die at home, and so signing very large numbers of death certificates. So their patients weren't dying in hospital. They were working in retirement communities, Eastbourne and places like that. They never knew they were being monitored. This was all done anonymously, and thank goodness for that, because for these very good GPs to be identified in any public way would have been really unfortunate, to say the least. And what I always use this as an argument about is that the statistics can find the correlation. They can't find the causation. And so all it can do is say something unusual is happening. They can't say why. And we've got to be really careful about automatic monitoring systems that's made absolutely clear. Okay, so to conclude, just a COVID inquiry, for heaven's sakes, got a very challenging job. As much of the evidence and claims are statistical during COVID, and good luck to them is what I say. But the experience I've had with my colleagues is the need for really close collaboration between statisticians and lawyers to improve the communication of uncertainty in court and in inquiries. And sometimes the probative value of evidence can be put into possibly rough numbers, likelihood ratios, but you need to be able to be clear about the limitations in the assessment. Legal professionals need training. There should be a MOOC on the way to do all this. But that from a statistical point of view, I repeat that giving evidence with the affected families and the audience, it does require great care, but it can be very, very rewarding indeed. So just finally, I'd like to make enormous acknowledgement to all the people that I've worked with on these 3 different inquiries. It's been a real journey, extraordinary people, which you can see the names there. In the affected blood, Sheila Bird and Ruth and Sarah and the others put in so much work. It's untrue on these areas. So it's been a huge honour and pleasure to work with these people on what I think are important areas for statisticians to get involved in. And with that, I shall shut up and again apologise for running out of power. Right. Okay.
It's okay. We had a good chat about statistics while you were
gone. Good.
Yeah,
probably better than me. Yeah.
So I can take questions in the chat, or if you want to speak, you can put your hand up and I'll try and get people in roughly the right order, although there's quite a lot of people in the meeting, so I might not see you. There was a question during your talk, which says, apart from acknowledging that a statistician is an expert in that field, why should the courts rely on evidence from a statistician? What assurance should a judge or jury have in the evidence provided?
Yeah, that's a good idea, because statisticians can, might get things wrong as much as anyone else. Well, I think that's why I think, a lot of evidence is statistical. So the first thing is to, like in COVID, to recognize that a huge amount of evidence, that's the very first step, is to get the legal people running the inquiry to realize there are statistical issues. And all the inquiries I've been involved in, that was absolutely clear from the start. And it was a real pleasure to collaborate with people in that circumstances. Having done that, it's the responsibility of the inquiry to find people who know what they're talking about. And I do think that's where the Royal Statistical Society has a strong role, professional bodies, to ensure that, you know, you really do need people who know what they're doing. And it's not, you know, I would say it's not for the faint-hearted either, because the point about it is that it is, as I hope I've shown, it tends to be really messy stuff. And I think that it does help to have had quite a lot of experience in dealing with quite tricky, challenging problems in order to deal with the sort of questions you're confronted with. And you also have to have the absolute willingness to say, I can't answer that. You know, so it's just the evidence is just not good enough for me to have confidence in any answer. So I think it's like anything else. They've got to ensure that there is professional credibility of the people they use.
Oh, someone's just popped their hand up. Oh, there's two questions in the chat, actually. So Tom King's asked, if the Y chromosome is mismatched, how do we know if it is mistaken paternity and not the comparator? I'm not sure I understand that question.
I'm not sure if I understand that. All I know is that it was concluded that there were, you know, gaps in the paternity thing. And over 600 years, it's almost certain there will have been.
Okay.
So, yeah, Tom, I'll have a think about that. I can't think fast enough to work out quite a good answer for that.
Okay, so Ian Hunt is asking, have you been involved in interesting cases where the statistical evidence was inconsistent with the legal intuition or other evidence? Is this harder for the statistician?
Oh, I'm just in these inquiries. I think it fitted in pretty well. I don't think there was anything massively surprising that the statistical evidence came up with. I'm sure that there are cases where it is, but and again, we've got to be a bit careful what we say at the moment. So that's I haven't been involved in that
yet. Benjamin, do you want to say your question?
Yes, I mean, it's a follow up on what you know, what you said. See, that what I'm thinking about, Prof, is you are a statistician, you are the expert, and the courts acknowledge that. But how do you convince them that what you are saying is right? They don't understand statistics. You do. How do you convince a judge or a jury who knows nothing about statistics, you know, that what you are saying is right? Apart from them just, you know, acknowledging that you are the expert.
Yeah, that is such a good question. I think I should pass this over to Sheila as well. I think there is an issue, and I think this is where the communication is different. You have to avoid technicalities at all costs. You know, even if you use them behind the scenes, you do not put them up there. You've got to be able to give testimony in a way that is, I think, convincing to audiences and the lawyers there. And that means, you know, being able to demonstrate using graphics as clearly as possible so that what you're doing has strong face validity. It just seems reasonable. It doesn't seem like magic. It doesn't seem like just an authority speaking. We don't want that at all, and it doesn't mystify them with mathematics. So, although I want, that's why I brought in all the sequential monitoring stuff behind the scenes. There may be some pretty heavy-duty ideas and statistical ideas, similarly in DNA or whatever. In the end, you have to present it in a way that is convincing. But it is a problem because, in a way, you first of all have to be convinced yourself, and your colleagues have to be convinced. So you do have to have a way to, I think, professional agreement that this is a reasonable thing to say, and then present it in a way that seems reasonable to an audience. It's exactly the same as dealing with the media as well, who don't expect the audience to understand the technicalities, but you do want them to take you seriously. And I think that is communication as much as anything. And you can't just rely on being an authority. I don't think you have to be able to explain it and make it sound reasonable. But a very good point. Yeah.
That actually links quite nicely to another question that's been posted in the chat from Stephen. He says, inquiry hearings operate on an inquisitorial system. What's the difference when you consider the adversarial conditions of a criminal court?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've avoided the criminal court. I've not been subject to none of these things. You're subject to cross-examination, the only time I suppose under no, that's true. No, the GMC case was a court. They had barristers on the side of the GMC, and each of the defendants had a barrister. No, I was. God, it was really vicious. It was, and I wasn't properly brave. They were really hard and harsh and trying to pick corners on my credibility, on my language, what I did. They had questioned the material and deliberately didn't put in their complaints about it till midnight the day before the case. So I was running all the analysis overnight again to produce new work. They played every trick, every nasty trick. And so I think, yeah, dealing with that inquisitorial thing is another level of having to be braced for defending what you're saying. I have been subject to it. It was quite ruthless. A lot of that is practice. You've got to just, it's like doing good media training. You have to have practice against every hole someone's going to try to pick in what you're saying. Yeah. You have to rehearse it. God, I've forgotten that experience.
So David Green says, speaking as an occupational disease barrister, how can statisticians bridge the gap between A, clear epidemiological evidence demonstrating a likely causal link between X, the agent, and Y, the injury, and B, being able to say in an individual case that the claimant has, on balance of probabilities, developed Y as a result of X? Or is it the job of statisticians to do A and leave B to the experts?
Oh, great. You have to buy my book. I've got a whole chapter on causation in which I deal with attribution, not just in climate change, but in civil cases. I do Mr. Cookson against Novartis, the standard one of that. So probability of causation, can you use a relative risk greater than 2 to show a greater than balance of probabilities that it was caused by the agent in the individual case? Now, I think extending from epidemiological studies to individual attribution is increasingly important, as I say, not just in civil cases anymore, but also in climate change and other areas. So it is a really important issue, and I think it's an area where it is a statistical responsibility, definitely, to understand those issues, but it's also one where you need really close collaboration with the lawyers who will know something about the balance of probabilities and use of evidence and so on. But it is a statistical issue that you can under certain assumptions to develop a probability of causation, 1 minus 1 over the relative risk and so on. So it's in there. I think it's a fascinating area that statisticians, attribution studies, not generally part of statistical work, but I think they will increasingly become so, and it's an increasingly important area to know something about.
Also briefly advertised that the section was involved in writing Inns of Court College of Advocacy Guide, which has a section at the end on this sort of thing. And hopefully we'll discuss some of these topics at this meeting, the Mardia Prize Workshop meeting that I mentioned next month. So Peter C has asked, do you support the use of log likelihood ratios rather than a Bayesian analysis in court proceedings?
Well, they're the same thing, essentially. Log likelihood is just like multiplying likelihood ratios. And, that's just Bayes' theorem without calculating the posterior probability. And I think that in court is a bit, that Richard III argument, I don't think would stand up you don't think you could use that in court. Each of those individual ones you might be able to use, but current, as far as I can see in the UK, you couldn't multiply them up together or add up the logs. So I personally think it is really useful, but it's supposed to be for the jury responsibility to combine different independent sources of evidence rather than a mathematical equation. That's been decided, unfortunately, I think, but that's the way it is. So I think, with current precedent, that's where it is. You can't do the multiplication or the addition on a log scale. I think I wouldn't want to use log likelihood rate. People are now so used to using likelihood ratios with having that scale. I wouldn't want to go on to log likelihood ratios, even though that is actually a really good way to communicate weights of evidence. I don't think we should try to introduce that into legal work. It'd be too confusing.
So Malcolm Blake's added a question which actually links quite nicely to the answer to your previous question. So he says he's sitting with a class of further mathematicians at a school. Can he ask how you get the experience you mention, i.e. how do you start down this path? That kind of links to your point about, well, you need to have experience to be in the criminal cases. How do you get it?
Yeah, no, I think as I said, it helps to have had quite a long experience of dealing with messy problems, because none of these are nice, well organized rectangular data sets which you can assume are correct and trying to find a single answer and things like that. But it helps, as you notice, I am talking about how I'm glad they're watching, because you can just see the value of hypothesis tests. I was talking about null hypotheses, alternatives, all that stuff is in type 1 and type 2 errors. It all comes into it. It's all there. And the probability theory is all there. So all these kind of basic, techniques that one can learn in school and university are being used, but using them appropriately is tricky, and I think it requires quite a lot of experience because of there's always multiple data sources. They may be in conflict. You've got to judge the quality of the evidence, etc., etc. So I think my feeling about this, and when I talk, it says, well, if you're interested in this stuff, do as much maths as possible, do as much probability theory as possible, do as much statistical theory and inference ideas as possible, and then move into more applied areas, maybe starting with quite neat applied areas like randomized clinical trials can be quite nice, and areas which are fairly disciplined and where you might end up with quite a neat, tidy data set to do something with, or scientific experiments which are well run, and then gradually start moving into the messy stuff. And and you end up here with this stuff, which is the messiest of all, I think. Yeah.
Sheila, did you want to ask a question?
Well, really just to underline David's point about preparation, because when we were for the infected blood inquiry, David and I shared between us the various chapters of the report that we would have to speak to, and we wrote up, which neither of us necessarily would do otherwise, how we would address which table or figure we wanted to have put up. So it was a sort of suggestion to the barrister that this would be a way of doing it, and this is how we would like to put things over. And then I was at a super spreader event and got COVID, and our cross-examination was postponed by about 5 weeks. But fortunately, we'd written all this up, and David didn't actually have 50 fits, which I think if the boot had been on the other foot, I would have done when we were all prepared. But actually, that preparation served us well.
Yep.
Because it wasn't such a huge effort to go back to it 5 weeks later. But mea culpa, I went to an infectious disease meeting and got COVID. And the judge said, somebody should say something to Sheila about risk.
Yeah. But she is absolutely right. The preparation is incredibly important, and realizing is the other. It's because, and then you realize you are talking to multiple audiences. You've got a sort of scientific. You want to make sure that what you're doing is respectable to your peers. You're answering the questions from the barrister, and you're actually talking to the audience in the front row, the families in the front row, and you've got to make sure that you're trying to address their questions and talking in a way. It can sound a bit brutal, it can sound, harsh, but actually you are addressing the things that they want to know. Yeah. So it's the preparation is really vital. Yeah. And the teamwork as well. This is all of these things it was a huge amount of teamwork on the shipment, the Bristol, and infected blood. It's all teamwork, and everyone contributing and checking and making sure that what we're saying makes sense and so on. Yeah.
I guess when you've got multiple people involved, it's nice to have that backup of knowing that
Oh,
other
God,
people are
yes.
agreeing with what you're saying.
Oh, I'd never do any of this stuff want to do it on my own. I'd be terrified. No. You want to, yeah.
Toby, did you just put your hand up, or?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, David, for a great talk. I'm on the research team of the COVID inquiry, and
good luck, as I said.
We've got quite a few of our legal colleagues have joined the call as well.
All right.
We've all found it very valuable hearing your talk. When you've got an inquiry of really vast scope, you could include thousands of statistical results that are highly relevant.
Yeah.
So how would you approach prioritizing which numbers are most important?
Yeah, yeah, it's a very good question. I think I'd probably look at the ones that are most disputed to some extent, in that, there's some that really, people could agree with. I mean, I wouldn't think it's worthwhile spending ages working out the exact different definitions of a COVID death, for example. I could give you 6 off the top of my head. I think, they changed over time and all this sort of stuff. But actually, it's well understood, I think, what went on. So I think it would be more valuable to identify some of the more disputed issues. Yeah, and others, the messy stuff. Yeah.
Do you mean disputed in the media or in the scientific community?
Yeah, I think in the media side and in public discourse. I mean, there's a lot. I mean, I don't think inquiry can address every extreme viewpoint of every skeptical view there is. The claims that there was never a pandemic anyway, and so on. I don't think it's possibly worth doing. But there are others where there has been, I think, quite reasonable debate about. And I think, for example, calculations of excess deaths, which there's no correct answer, and is still, being changed, and the appropriateness of comparing between countries, the using statistical methods to evaluate the effects of lockdown, things like that. I mean, these are really, really messy problems. Now, whether they, which are not amenable, I think, to precise answers. But actually, I think that if an inquiry is going to answer questions that people are interested in, these are the ones people are interested in. I think they're the ones that are being disputed, that are disputed. But that maybe that's too much reflecting my personal interest.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you.
So Ian Hunt's asked another interesting question in the chat. So he says, Jonathan Sumption said in a Reith lecture that law is expanding in our world. Is the statistician's role within law expanding, do you think?
Yeah, I think so, and quite rightly too. Obviously in collaboration, but I think it is. I think the interest in the primers, the judicial primers, and the other areas, I think the interest in the Supreme Court as well on these issues, I think does reflect the importance. And there are so many. I mean, the problem is, I think, getting people to realise that there are statistical issues that they don't realise necessarily are statistical issues, because I think there may be a tendency for people to think, oh, it's just common sense, or it's like, no, it is not common sense. Anything with numbers is not common sense. That's the one thing I've learned, especially when you start talking about, well, that's, you wouldn't expect that just by chance, or so. No, you do not leave those. That is not common sense. Humans have not got the common sense to judge that. And so I think that I think there will be a greater role, quite rightly, and but that needs collaboration and mutual respect and understanding.
Sheila, did you want to add to that?
Not so much to add to it, but to ask David whether he thought that in our lifetimes we might see randomized controlled trials in criminal justice. For example, randomization to sentencing, to sentence, to find out which sentences actually work. I
would hope so. A completely reasonable thing to do. But yeah, you'd hope so. But randomized trials of policies are really difficult to really difficult to implement on the whole, unfortunately. But I think that sounds entirely sensible.
John Fraser's asked, what about areas in law such as chancery and tax that can be very dense and complex? How best to approach as a statistician if required to provide an opinion?
Yeah, that's. I mean, I've got to manage to avoid that stuff. Really? No. I mean, you know, yeah, no, very, very difficult. I mean, I wonder whether partly because it's numerical, but I'm not sure how much of it is statistical in terms of dealing with uncertainty and you know, what can we learn from the evidence, what can we learn from the data, rather than you know, it can be data, but if it's just a simple summary of what went on, which everyone can agree with, and that's the facts, then it's not really statistical in the sense that we would understand it when we are trying to interpret what does the data mean, you know, when it arose from some form of unpredictability or randomness. So I'm not sure where the stats would come into those sorts of cases. Certainly, as we heard earlier, they come into the civil case. The attribution cases is deeply statistical, anything to do with attribution. But I'm not sure about tax and things like that.
Has anybody in the audience got a statistical tax question?
Yeah, maybe so. Yeah, it's numerical, but I'm not sure if I'd consider it statistical.
Right. Okay, so it's 2:15 now, so I better bring things to a close. But thanks a lot for that, David. That was really, really interesting. And thanks a lot.
I'm sorry about the break, the commercial break.
Yeah, that's fine. And thanks a lot to everyone for the great questions. Someone's pointed out that we have a list of statistical consultants on the RSS website, which is quite helpful. So thanks everyone for coming, and I'll send out a newsletter over the next month or two once we sort out our next meeting. Otherwise, as I said, this video will be posted on the RSS YouTube channel as well, if you want to send it out to anyone else or watch again. Okay, thanks everyone, and thanks very much,
so
David.
Much indeed. Thank you for forgiving me. Thank you. If you have. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.